Good morning. My name is Hermann Pretorius, and I am the Deputy Head of Policy Research for the Institute of Race Relations. I'm very glad that you all can join us this morning for this Friends breakfast briefing. It being a breakfast briefing, I strongly considered having some bacon and eggs ready here with me to do this presentation, but for professionalism's sake, I decided against it. So the title of today's briefing is A Trimmed Down Approach for South Africa, Getting SMMEs, the Economy and the Country into a State of Recovery. Today's briefing follows on a policy memorandum that we published this week and sent to the government and several key ministers regarding the lockdown situation in South Africa. We did this on the back of some constructive engagement with government on policy proposals. We're not going to pretend that government has done everything right. There are severe failures that we have seen over the last few weeks, and government continues to make the mistakes we expect of government to make. However, it would be remiss of me not to thank some parts of the government, especially the presidency and the Department of Health, specifically the Minister of Health, for collaborating with us, being approachable, being constructive, and being open to listening to alternative policy proposals and ideas. Now, the Institute of Race Relations was founded in 1929, so for more than 90 years, we've been practicing this art of coming up with solutions, of coming up with policies. And it's perhaps apt that we look into the crystal ball and we see a crisis now. Perhaps we don't even have to look into the crystal ball. We look at our balance sheets, we look at our business books, we look out the window, and we understand that South Africa is facing a severe crisis. Some world economists have said this is the most severe crisis since 1929. And that perhaps is apt. The Institute of Race Relations was founded in 1929, and we have ever since been at the forefront in South Africa of devising policy solutions for the challenges faced by South Africans. And the scale of this challenge might be different. The nature of this challenge might be different. But the fact remains that we, as the Institute of Race Relations, are solution-orientated, positive, constructive, cautious, in-depth, data-based, and more than anything, true friends of South Africa. So for the friends of the IRR attending this morning's briefing, this is about you. This is about making sure that the friends of South Africa, the friends of the IRR, can really stand together, understand what's going on with our friends in other homes and other provinces and other cities, and help carry this country we all love through this crisis. So to start, I will now move on to the next slide. The structure of today's briefing will be quite simple. We will have a brief introduction, then part one, detailing the risks of the lockdown approach. Part two, focusing on how to get SMMEs and the broader economy into a state of recovery using the trim down approach. And then part three, the steps government should take to enable a successful trim down strategy. Thereafter, I will open up the floor to a few questions, and we will please feel free to ask them, to type them in the chat function, the typing function. If we are going to speak with many microphones on many devices, then we might experience some difficulties. So questions in writing at this stage will simply be easier. Right, let's get down to it. If we look at the timeline, on the 5th of March, the first confirmed case of COVID-19 in South Africa is identified in KwaZulu-Natal. 10 days later, on the 15th of March, President Ramaphosa announces a state of disaster in terms of the Disaster Management Act. The 23rd of March, President Ramaphosa announces the national lockdown. On the 25th of March, the Institute of Race Relations publishes Friends in Need, a comprehensive policy response framework that diagnoses 6 key areas of focus for policy. We not only look at the problems within those areas of focus, we came up with solutions, published these solutions, and interacted with key government players on them. The areas Friends in Need focused on, and we continue looking at these areas, continually updating our models and data, are as follows. Firstly, healthcare access and stability. Secondly, economic stability. Thirdly, income security. Fourthly, financial stability. Fifthly, civil liberties. And finally, social and socio-economic stability. On the 26th of March, the day after we publish Friends in Need, the national lockdown comes into effect. And on the 9th of April, President Ramaphosa announces the extension of the lockdown. In the trimmed down approach document that we published this week, we said that South Africa is in the state of lockdown, but it cannot remain in the state of lockdown. Why do we say that? Well, this chart shows some extent as to why. South Africa is the country 5th from the right on this graph, with the blue bars indicating the growth forecasts before the COVID-19 crisis, and the orange bars, the growth forecasts under the latest available data. South Africa went into this crisis with low growth expectations. If we look at other countries, perhaps not on this graph, but if we look at other developing nations around the world, South Africa underperforms by approximately 50% the GDP growth of other countries, and that was before this crisis hit us. So going into this, we really didn't have a very sound hull to our ship of state. And as this graph shows, this crisis will hit us even harder. My colleagues in the Institute have estimated that we are looking perhaps not at the 3% GDP decline that this graph is showing, but even a greater decline of around 5%. Some economists we've spoken to have estimated that the decline could be as much as 10%. As a general rule of thumb, it might be good to look at every percentage point of GDP growth as 100,000 job opportunities. For every 1% of GDP growth, 100,000 new job opportunities are created. And for every percentage point of GDP lost, the inverse, of course. So when we say South Africa cannot remain in a lockdown situation, we don't say it because graphs like these energize the economists or the researchers at the Institute of Race Relations. We say it because these graphs, properly understood, and the data properly understood, shows the effect of crises on human lives. Someone on Twitter the other day said quite astutely that if you want to talk about the economy, replace the word economy with the phrase, the ability for people to eat. That's what the economy essentially boils down to, the ability of people to have their needs met. This isn't about figures, this is about people. And the reality is, if we want to save lives and livelihoods, you cannot have a blunt approach in either direction. I don't think it would be right to continue the lockdown situation in South Africa. The economic damage it would incur would simply be too great. But nor do I think it would be right to approach this situation in a laissez-faire capitalist way, saying, open the markets completely. Don't care about the risks involved in that. Now, as a free market capitalist myself, I don't wish to disappoint anyone who shares my capitalist instincts, or that indeed of the Institute of Race Relations. But the reality is we have to thread the needle, and we have to balance between two killers. On the one hand, poverty, and on the other hand, pandemic. It is not possible for us to choose one over the other. It would be irresponsible in the extreme for South Africa to survive the pandemic aspect of this crisis, but not to survive the consequences of the crisis. It would be no good winning the war, but losing the peace. Lives will be lost in that scenario, and those lives will be the lives of the poorest South Africans, the most vulnerable South Africans. The Institute of Race Relations has been around for about 90 years, and our CEO, Frans Cronje, yesterday said in a podcast that he was an analyst during the Mbeki years at the Institute of Race Relations, and the Institute analyzed and saw firsthand the medical and humanitarian disaster of HIV and AIDS. And those lessons learned, the cost of government policy getting it wrong, are starkly illustrated in every policy approach we take. We cannot sacrifice lives for the economy, but we cannot look at the economy as an abstract concept of numbers. We have to look at it, to use the phrase that I'm stealing from Twitter, we have to look at the economy as the ability of people to eat. The lockdown scenario and extensions of the lockdown risks the economy in a great way. And if I'm going to take my own advice, it risks the ability of people to eat and of people to look after their loved ones. And many of you listening to this know this perhaps better than myself. You know how important an income is to look after a family. It is not something you can go without. And when we listen to public figures in this country saying almost Schadenfreude, in a way of Schadenfreude, in this anticipation of some form of, ha, I told you so. When we listen to these people say, you only care about livelihoods, you only care about numbers and money, not about people, we must remind them, and we must not let that moment slide to remind them, that the economy is the ability of people to care for themselves and their loved ones. And the lockdown approach, the rigid lockdown approach, risks that. And I will now go on to explain why, in the South African context, the lockdown approach is so dangerous. On balance, we have to say that the response of the Department of Health to this crisis has been good. However, justified frustration regarding the availability of data and access to government advisors have been a problem and building in the journalistic and NGO sector, and we ourselves have shared this frustration. But we are grateful to the government having in the last week taken steps to address this. However, perhaps the greatest failing of the Department of Health has been the rolling out of testing, which has been relatively slow. But an uptick in the number of tests in the last week bodes very well. This week, from the 17th of April, we've already tested at a higher daily average than 2 or 3 or 4 weeks ago. There was a time when the number of tests dipped or remained worryingly consistent. And if we are to make a successful attempt at this, the global consensus clearly is that testing medical testing, consistent, widespread, effective, and streamlined testing for COVID-19 sits at the heart of a country's ability to respond successfully to this crisis. So again, the Department of Health, if it can prove that the testing regimes and testing infrastructure it is now putting in place or have put in place over the last week or two, that would bode well. But we cannot view these matters in isolation. The uncomfortable reality is that South Africa's public health system simply is not up to the task of responding to the crisis as other nations are. South Africans, perhaps more than politicians, are familiar with the shortcomings of the public health system. We have all seen in the news, and we at the Institute have seen in the data as well, the harrowing stories of people not being cared for, being neglected, or simply not getting the treatment they need from the public health system. That requires the Department of Health to take a new approach, because fixing what is broken in the system cannot realistically be achieved over the coming months. That is why we at the Institute are impressing on government and on the Department of Health specifically the necessity of ensuring efficient collaboration between the private and public sectors. Today's presentation will borrow heavily from the Friends in Need policy document that we published on the 25th of March. And in that document, we go to some lengths to propose ways in which the public sector and the private sector in terms of healthcare can collaborate closely. One of the points we raise, and we will return to it later in this presentation, is the idea of emergency COVID medical treatment vouchers. The reality is we have care and we have funding. The state might have the funding due to its impressive taxing ability that all states have. But the private sector, by all empirical standards, has the highest care standards and the highest quality of care. But in South Africa, we are faced with this problem that the most vulnerable South Africans cannot have access to that care. How can this be achieved? That is where the voucher system comes in so crucially. The voucher system offers the opportunity for the Department of Health to connect the needed care with the available funding. Poor South Africans, vulnerable South Africans who cannot afford the highest quality of care, through a voucher system, will be able to afford it. Because the state, while not providing the care, while not following a nationalized approach to healthcare, would be able to make the resources available to the private sector to care for the poor. However, the private sector must also step up in this regard, and it is promising and very encouraging that the private sector has already shown its willingness and eagerness to do so. So when we say that the Department of Health must ensure efficient collaboration between the private and public sectors, that is what we mean. We cannot fix what is broken in our health system. Alternative approaches and solutions must be found. If the government does that, if the Department of Health creates and imposes such a system, such a collaborative system between private and public, then we can achieve the necessary medical capacity and healthcare capacity to look after the most vulnerable people in South Africa. But the real risks to the efforts of the Department of Health, if they take the advice we strongly urge them to take to look after the most vulnerable and those who cannot afford it, The risks posed to this fall wider than just the ability of the Department of Health. If the lockdown measures or similar measures fail to enable the Department of Health to roll out testing at sufficient scale, to lay the groundwork for infrastructure and equipment and treatment, we face the very real risk as a country of an all pain, no gain scenario. So the first thing that must happen is the Department of Health must build on the solid foundation it has, with some mistakes, but in general, good aims and effectiveness built. It must do that by taking our advice and the advice of people who understand how private-public sector collaboration can work to the benefit of all. If that does not happen, then the lockdown scenarios we are in and the lockdown scenarios we might face might result in all pain and no gain. This danger of all pain, no gain really is illustrated in the scale and extent of the current lockdown, and we should be very concerned. Because if the medical data and the medical consensus is that the most vulnerable South Africans are elderly people, people in multi-generational households, immunocompromised people, if you take into consideration factors like tuberculosis and HIV and AIDS, the most at-risk communities are clearly the poor, and these South Africans typically live in informal settlements. Now, there are more than 400 informal settlements in Gauteng alone, and millions of South Africans live in these areas under very challenging socioeconomic conditions. For these communities in these informal settlements, the intended benefit of the lockdown in halting the spread of the pandemic could be limited. Why do we say this? For the following 4 reasons. Firstly, taking into account that these South Africans are not rich, are not well off, are not comfortable, socioeconomic pressures might prove so severe that despite isolation or lockdown measures, increasing numbers of people are compelled to try and gain an income and thus risk spreading the virus. My colleague Ian Cruikshanks always says that poverty makes people very, very desperate. And I think we all understand that. Many people can sit through this lockdown in homes where they have internet access, where they can work, where they are not worried about going to buy food. But most South Africans in these informal settlements, the vulnerable South Africans, are not so cushioned against these socio-economic pressures. If these pressures become too great, it is completely expected and not irrational, sadly so, that socio-economic pressures will push the informal settlements of South Africa beyond what the lockdown or isolation measures are supposed to achieve. Secondly, we look at widespread ignorance or misinformation about the disease. Now, this isn't a new phenomenon, nor is it a phenomenon only known in informal settlements. Misinformation, as we see, really does not know class or race or geographical location. I have received many queries, and the Institute of Race Relations has received even more regarding questions on the disease. Now, while these questions are important, what is worrying is some of the answers. Now, as an organization in favor of liberty, we for no second condone the use of law and order with regards to misinformation. Instead of taking an aggressive approach to address ignorance and misinformation, the government must take a constructive, empowering approach. But the reality is that many South Africans, as with AIDS, are ignorant as to the risks of this disease. And in informal settlements, this might pose a significant risk due to the context of this ignorance or misinformation. A further point that informal settlements or poorer communities struggle with is a fundamental lack of trust between the citizens and law enforcement entities. Now, this undermines the ability of the state and the citizen to effectively collaborate in ensuring the lockdown regulations are peacefully adhered to. If you don't trust your police, that is a very great social risk, a social pressure. And informal settlements in South Africa do not have high levels of trust in the police. And that is, for many reasons, understandable. And I do not condemn that lack of trust for a moment, but I do think it tragically unfortunate. The fourth factor that might risk the effectiveness of the lockdown in informal settlements is the inconsistency of government itself in terms of regulations and lockdown measures. We've already seen the Minister of Transport flip-flopping to a significant extent on what the taxi industry can and cannot do. And speaking to people on the ground, it is clear that the taxi industry in broad is not currently following many of the limiting regulations. And that is in itself understandable. Socioeconomic pressures are pushing people dependent on this form of transport to seeking the income and the care and the nutrition they need. So government's inconsistency and many of the impracticalities of government regulations especially fall in negative consequence on the informal settlements. Now, these four risk factors, combined with the reality that isolation and self-isolation measures and working from home luxuries are not available widespread to the most vulnerable South Africans, create a cumulative worrying case for thinking that informal settlements, while being the most vulnerable in terms of the pandemic, are also volatile in terms of adherence to the lockdown regulations. That is 50% of a very significant problem. If the vulnerable are not protected by the lockdown, then the lockdown is failing. On the other side of the spectrum, we have the people in this country who can adhere, broadly speaking, to the lockdown measures. These would mostly be suburban middle-class South Africans. Now, this endurance might not be incredibly long-term, but it would be significantly longer term than the endurance abilities of poorer South Africans in informal settlements and under greater socioeconomic pressures. So the fact that middle-class South Africa broadly might be able to endure the lockdown measures for longer indicates that middle-class suburban South Africa is more likely to adhere to these lockdown measures. But taking into account the risks, suburban middle-class South Africans are not necessarily the most vulnerable to this disease. But this population segment also represents an enormous chunk of the consumer spending that accounts for such a large percentage of South Africa's GDP. So in the event of a lockdown and continuing as it currently is, and as it probably would be in any lockdown scenario, you'd have a middle class only lockdown due to the ability of the middle class to endure the lockdown measures. But at the same time, you are incapacitating a segment of your population that represents such an important gear in the economic machine of South Africa. So a middle-class only lockdown, where only the middle class endures and adheres the lockdown regulatory framework, would cause great economic damage, because consumer spending will inevitably, and is already, lowering to worrying and damaging levels. To conclude this first part, if the most vulnerable South Africans are not protected, but the most productive parts of the South African economy are simultaneously shut down, we sit with an all-pain, no-gain lockdown. The economy would have been put in a state of dormancy with great damaging effects without actually protecting the most vulnerable South Africans. We have to avoid this all-pain, no-gain scenario at all costs. We have to do so to save both lives and livelihoods. The problem statement being out of the way, the IRR's approach, part of a wide range of approaches that we will be looking at, working on, advising on over the coming months and weeks, is a trim-down approach. The trim-down approach essentially is aimed at allowing small, micro, and medium-sized enterprises to reopen, to reactivate, to get on their feet again, but doing so in a way that will not put the health of broader society in danger. I started this presentation by emphasizing the need to thread the needle between saving lives and livelihoods, and making the case that the one and the other cannot be really or realistically separated. The trim-down approach that I today announce to friends and in this presentation, and that we recommended to the government earlier this week, really seeks to do that. Perhaps a caveat at this point: there are risks involved in this approach, but no approach in a time of crisis is risk-free. This is not a question of getting to zero risk. That, unfortunately, just isn't possible. This is about finding a way to responsibly manage the risk and understand how lives and livelihoods can simultaneously be protected and our society kept from danger. SMMEs, these small, micro and medium-sized enterprises, really are the beating heart of our economy. And it has been traumatic to many South Africans to experience this beating heart stopping. I've spoken to many business owners of various sizes, and my colleagues at the Institute likewise, and the picture is a harrowing one. These people would like to work. They would like to pay their employees. They would like to make a contribution to the economic vibrancy of their communities. But the lockdown approach cuts them off at the knees. The trim-down approach seeks to address that and get them back on their feet. This trim-down approach consists of 4 points, each one relating to a trim down of some measure. Point 1 means trim down state expenditure. Point 2, trim down the risks associated with economic activities by introducing a COVID-19 risk scale. Point 3, trim down SMME expenses and enable them to improve their position on the COVID-19 risk scale. And 4, trim down red tape to ensure that you ease to the greatest extent possible the great pressures on SMMEs. Let's look at point 1, trimming down state expenditure. On this point, 4 simple recommendations can go a long way. Responsible and targeted departmental austerity, shelving expensive projects like the NHI that really has no realistic a chance of, in the short to medium term, improving the lives of South Africans. And the question of the NHI improving lives, even in the longer term, is one the IRR has been participating in for a long while, making clear that the NHI is in and of itself a dangerous project, and it will not result in what is being promised. But if we look narrower at the shorter time frame, these expensive projects must be shelved. They free up necessary resources in that way. Then scrap all bailouts to state-owned enterprises that can be scrapped without compromising economic productivity. A colleague of mine made the very sensible distinction that if we're going to speak about essential or non-essential, then perhaps a better place to apply it would be to SOEs rather than businesses. Because I think we can all agree that there are some essential SOEs, sudden overnight stopping of which would be complex and problematic, like the likes of Eskom. But other SMMEs, other SOEs, like SAA, surely should be considered non-essential at this time. So if the government wants to apply an essential, non-essential distinction, well, perhaps that distinction should begin in their own yard. The last point on how to trim down state expenditure would be cutting the public sector wage bill by 20%. Point one of trimming down state expenditure, point one of our 4-point plan, is a responsibility on the state, because trust between state and citizen is problematically low. By leading the way in this trim down approach, government can start rebuilding that trust relationship that has been damaged for too long by too many things. In this regard, the public sector wage bill is bloated. It is not a point of contention. The Minister of Finance himself and even the President have said similar things need to be done as cutting the public sector wage bill. This is a point where leadership can be shown. Leadership, the ANC, has been hesitant to show for too long. By cutting the public sector wage bill, it can be made clear that President Ramaphosa was not being dishonest when he was calling for a unified, united national effort. The private sector cannot bear the brunt of this economic crisis without the public sector stepping up to make sure the burden is shared. So point one requires a trim down of state expenditure. Point two is a rather complex point, and if I may say, it's what I would consider the meat and potatoes, the really hearty core of this trim down approach. It includes, or it covers, trimming down on the risks associated with economic activities by introducing a COVID-19 risk scale. I've mentioned already the distinction between essential and non-essential services, but I have to emphasize the arbitrariness and the destructive nature of that distinction here. That distinction between essential and non-essential services essentially fail on two crucial considerations. If you have a job, if you run a business and you employ South Africans who seek to look after themselves and their loved ones, there is no way that government can in good conscience make the case that your job is not essential to you. Of course, there are some people who work for convenience, but those people are mostly myth, fantasy, or a cousin's, brother's, sister's previous boss. It's never you, it's never me, it's never the South Africans who really go through this crisis too close to suffering and too close to hardship. So firstly, if you have a job and the government wants to tell you that that job is not essential and that they can, for that reason, withhold you from doing it and withhold you from gaining that income, that is wrong. The other reason this essential, non-essential distinction fails is the sectoral integration that we see in our economy. It's no use for some businesses to have the golden ticket certificate of essential service, only for their supply chain to be compromised where non-essential, quote unquote, other businesses cannot operate. If you are into veterinary medicine or other essential services, and you need something as simple as a label printer to be printed onto your bottles, or for that matter, bottles to be available for you to put your products in, you might have the essential service certificate, but a printing company at this stage, according to the government, would not be essential. Your ability to make your essential service and your products available to people who need them is thusly significantly and dangerously undermined. That is why we say scrap this essential, non-essential distinction. It is arbitrary, it is unhelpful, and it is destructive, and better alternatives are available. One such alternative, which I think can really go a long way in addressing many concerns, is the COVID-19 risk scale that we suggested to the government this week. Many of my colleagues do not agree that this might be a perfect solution. That's the nature of a think tank. You do not operate as a political party. You do not have a party line to toe, but you have a shared ideology and a shared approach, and you are free to differ within those margins. That being said, many of my colleagues do think this is a good approach, and that is why we published it. We have gotten some very good feedback on this risk scale from very important players in the economy and broad society. This risk scale does away with the distinction between essential and non-essential services, and it helps SMMEs and every business in this country to get back on their feet so that the beating heart of our economy can beat again. Now, what does this COVID risk scale entail? It has two stages. Stage one is a role where government must perform the main part. Government should create an industry-based classification of risk categories to establish baseline restrictions of allowable operational capacity. And let me pause at that point for a moment. It will become clear, I hope, in the next few slides, but perhaps it would be good to spend some time on it now. What this would mean is that industries can operate at anything from between 30% operational capacity to 100%, depending on their risk classification. The crucial difference here is that it is better to get your safer bits of the economy fully active or as active as possible without putting lives in danger than having a lockdown approach that is binary, black and white, and, perhaps too blunt, an axe where a scalpel is needed. So the industry-based classification by government of broad risk categories establish this baseline restriction of allowable operational capacity, industry by industry, and I think it will become clear in the next slide or two. The second stage of this risk scale essentially puts back the power of operation into the hands of small, micro, medium-sized enterprises. The thing is, these owners, these managers, these businesses need to build a relationship of trust and trade with their consumer base. They should be free to be able to take the steps they think and they feel would make their business safe, their clients safe, and therefore their business attractive to clients. If you walk by a shop and you see it is crowded and it is dirty, you as a consumer know that there's a risk in going into that shop. We can incentivize businesses to pay specific heed to these risks, and thereby we can really get this trimmed down approach to re-energize crucial areas of our economy. So the first stage is that categorization by risk. And this should be done based on virological, epidemiological advice and economic and financial considerations. That is what I think one might call the blinde sambok, because I laughed the other day significantly when another politician stumbled over that word, and now in front of you all, I do the same. But nonetheless, that categorization by risk of the first stage is where the government takes the advice of these people and take into account economic and financial considerations to understand a risk scale. Now, this risk scale should be established on the following three elements: the inherent virological and epidemiological risks in the industry's operations, the ability of industries to financially survive at limited operational capacity, and the inherent risks and requirements in the normal functioning of the industry and its relevant supply chains. Based on this criteria, this list of criteria, government should establish risk categories where higher risk categories necessitate lower percentages of operation and lower risk categories necessitate or free up higher baseline operational capacity percentage-wise. How would this work? This table is a suggestion. It is open to advice, to change, but this is the principle being illustrated in how this risk categorization by industry can work. To the left, you see numbers 1 to 6, 1 being the highest risk and 6 being the lowest risk. Then in the middle column, you see industry examples, and for this we use the government's own industry categorization. And to the right, you see the operational capacity baseline restriction examples. The highest risk category, taken on what we could find in terms of virological, epidemiological, and other considerations, clearly seem to be industries such as recreational, cultural, and sporting activities, specifically sporting events. And then on the other side of the safety risk spectrum, you might have your computer service, your lone plumber, those businesses who really work under such circumstances that their risk levels are very, very low. So if you are in risk category 1, the trim down approach, while you are at risk, does not prohibit you from complete operation. That lockdown approach will be too risky. The trim down approach suggests a more rational, staggered approach. Those in risk category 1 can operate at a baseline of 30% operational capacity. The scale flows from that point, taking into account the necessity of operational industries. Agriculture and computer services in this regard are good examples on this table because the food security of this country cannot suffer, so that capacity of business must be as high as possible. However, as this briefing perhaps clearly illustrates, nothing will now be more crucial to the limited functioning of the economy than the ability of the necessary IT and technological infrastructures to operate. So based on this table, I think the illustration becomes clear. If you run a risky business, you will unfortunately have to adapt to health risks. But as stage 2 of the risk scale would now illustrate, you are not left at that baseline operational capacity restriction. But that is a first step, and government can take a leading role in creating this framework. It is simple and it is workable, and it threads the needle between saving lives and livelihoods. The second stage of the application of the COVID risk scale falls into the hand of the business owner or the business itself. Because here you have scope to improve your risk quotient to exceed the industry-wide baseline restriction. Let me illustrate this point. If you're a restaurant, according to the risk category or the COVID risk scale, you fall into risk category 2. That equates to a 60% baseline restriction on your operational capacity. Simply put, you can operate at 60% of what you would have operated at. You don't fire on all cylinders, you fire on 60% of cylinders. As unattractive as that might seem, 60% is a great improvement on 0% of the lockdown approach. But that is not where this trimmed down approach ends. Now stage 2 kicks in, and you as a restaurant owner can take certain steps to improve on your baseline operational capacity of 60%. You can add a number of percentage points if you provide sufficient sanitization equipment to staff and customers. You can add even further if you adopt something like staggered time schedules to accommodate at-risk age groups, as retailers have already done, much to their credit. Or you can add extra capacity on top of that 60% if you install isolation measures within your business. There are establishments in Hong Kong that have already taken such measures. Acrylic, plastic, or perspex sheets have been used to isolate tables that would otherwise share a space. Now, that might not again be ideal, but it might get you back on your feet, and it might get many South Africans back into your business, seeing that you want to keep them safe. This expansion of baseline operational capacity, I suggest, should operate on 3 levels. Firstly, assessments by customers or clients. Make sure that your entity in a trimmed down approach has the infrastructure and available documentation or rating mechanisms for customers to honestly consider the risk steps you've taken, keeping COVID-19 in mind. Secondly, your employees. If you can satisfy your employees, or if you as an employee can be satisfied that sensible risk measures have been taken, that should count in your favor. And then the third point, this would need some policy development, and we are working on that. But the principle of auditing these types of risks, these types of in-house, as it were, assessments and documentations is not unknown to business. Businesses get audited, and risk of businesses can be done likewise. The business can have the legal or the state mandated responsibility to undergo risk audits, taking into account customer and employee satisfaction with safety measures. But the state does not get involved here beyond making that type of activity necessary. This frees up the economy. This frees up businesses to take sensible, reasonable steps to keep themselves safe, and crucially, to keep their customers safe. The point of illustrating the necessity of saving lives and livelihoods here really comes to the fore. Point 2 being the risk scale, being the meat and potatoes of this approach, is thus concluded. Point 3 of this approach really builds on point 2. SMMEs will have to incur expenses to enable them to improve their position on the risk scale. For this, government should provide once-off risk quotient improvement subsidies. And banks should be incentivized to provide very lenient risk quotient improvement loans. Practical examples of this could be to assist a business to go digital with a website that it never needed to operate. It might be additional costs, but these expenses can be helped by government. If you need to deliver where in the past customers came to you, there should be an ability for you to get necessary funding or resources to improve your position on the risk scale. If you sell blinds or curtains, for example, and people used to come to your shop, you can improve vastly on your risk quotient by instead becoming a delivery-based shop with a website. Now, that would take expenses that you did not budget for. And that is where these RQISs and improvement loans can really help you in your case. Point 4 really cuts to the heart of what has been standing in the way of many SMMEs for too long. Ease red tape pressures on these businesses. If I could perhaps call back one of my favorite politicians, I would say, Mr. Ramaphosa, tear down this red tape. The first point we make is that race-based criteria for government assistance and employment should be scrapped. It is unconscionable that a country that purports to be a constitutional non-racial democracy can discriminate on the basis of race. It was unwise and destructive to do that before this crisis. To insist on race-based criteria now is nothing more or less than callous. We've been criticized, especially my IRR colleague, Terence Corrigan, by the Minister of Tourism, for really strongly calling her out on the absurdity and the immorality of race-based policies. And the Minister of Tourism, in a letter yesterday, specifically targeted Mr. Corrigan and implied, not so subtly, that he must be a racist. The point made is that you cannot be in favor of the upliftment and the economic participation of Black South Africans if you are not in favor of BEE and Black economic empowerment measures or similar race-based policies. That is grasping at ridiculous straws to build a ridiculous straw man. The minister should be ashamed that she can so easily vacuum pack the racism and the talking points in a time of crisis. The reality is that BEE has not worked. It has not worked to empower the South Africans it was purportedly meant to empower. It has created an elite, rich clique of well-connected South Africans. And the data shows that almost equal percentages of white and Black South Africans answer in the affirmative to the question, have you personally received a BEE tender? Black South Africans, 11%, white South Africans, 10%. How is it acceptable that this perverted race-based policy can survive in a constitutional democracy, never mind a constitutional democracy in a crisis? That must be scrapped. And SMMEs, the economy and people who can then eat, live, and build a better life for themselves and their loved ones, will thank whatever government or whatever politician scraps this abhorrent policy. It must go. A second, more nuanced point we make is that minimum wage regulation should be temporarily suspended. While the minimum wage might be a catch-all net in times of relative prosperity, now it will cost jobs. With a risk scale in mind, Businesses should be allowed to pay their employees in accordance with their risk quotient. The minimum wage makes this impossible in many cases and difficult in too many others. Now is the time to be sensible, to be pragmatic about this. We'd rather save jobs, trim down now so that the job survives this crisis and then fatten up again, as it were, after in times of prosperity, than we have strict adherence to ideological positions like the minimum wage that will make jobs not trimmed down, but destroyed by being locked down. That is why we say the minimum wage regulations should be temporarily suspended and can be reintroduced at a fixed formulaic point in the future, whether it is related to unemployment rates or economic growth. It can be done, and it is a pragmatic approach to making sure that we save these livelihoods and incomes. And the last point of point 4 is to say that based on the positions of SMMEs on the COVID-19 risk scale, businesses should be able to enjoy or receive appropriate tax relief. To go back to the example of the curtain or blind seller who used to have a shop, but now under this new plan can operate remotely from having a website and having a delivery-based service. That delivery-based service should be exempt from specific tax requirements. These are practical steps that can make sure the coordinated broader response of the IRR delivers on saving lives and livelihoods. To the last part of today's presentation, the steps government should take to enable a successful trim down strategy. Harking back to the very start of this presentation, the Department of Health must use and be allowed to use the breathing space provided by the lockdown up to now and the breathing space that a trim down strategy would create in future to put in place necessary infrastructure for testing and treatment. They can do this through collaboration with the private sector, through the use of COVID-19 emergency treatment vouchers, as I discussed earlier, through the making available of emergency COVID-19 isolated care vouchers, where the tourism industry, so hard hit through this crisis, can make their facilities available at reasonable payment levels to people who cannot self-isolate or cannot afford to self-isolate. Use the now empty structures economically to house people who are at risk. Remove the most vulnerable from the dangerous circumstances they find themselves in, but let them remove themselves, empower people. Don't fall into the trap of forced relocation. South Africa has seen that film play out before. If we empower people through vouchers, if the government understands that it can provide the funds and private sector businesses can provide the care, can provide the products, can provide the service, that would be the perfect collaboration between state and citizen. And it might even go some distance into re-establishing some form of trust in this country. The second point that government must do is that it must manage social pressures in a way that avoids pushing people into violating isolation protocols. In this regard, your police services, your law enforcement really has a vital role to play. The minister should, under no circumstances, be allowed to be cavalier with the safety of South Africans. The last point on that is that the presidency should show zero tolerance for any department, minister or government official that compromises the effectiveness of isolation controls. I would like to thank you for giving me your time to take you through these 3 parts and the points of the trim down approach. It is a fair approach. It balances lives and livelihoods, and it makes sure that SMMEs in this country, small, medium and micro-sized enterprises, can get back on their feet at the same time, keeping health risks and the safety of South Africans in mind.